Hey film fans, welcome to Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and have you ever wondered what a film version of the old game Oregon Trail would be like? No, you haven't, because that game was horrible. It was an exercise in frustration and death. When I first showed it to my son when I think he was 9 years old, I thought he wasn't going to talk to me for a few days because he got like 3 days away from his destination and died of dysentery. That's life, kid. That's life on the trail. However, if you have wondered what a film of the Oregon Trail would be like, you're in luck because Kelly Reichardt made it in 2010. And as we wrap up this sort of mini-series of considering the films of the great Kelly Reichardt, we are going to discuss that film. So please join me as we consider the 2010 film Meek's Cutoff in this episode of what makes this film great. Hi film fans, just a quick reminder that I'm now on Patreon, where I'm adding lots of new content all the time. If you like what I've been doing here and you've been watching these vids for a while, why don't you head on over there and drop me a dime. Link in the description. Meek's Cutoff was directed by Kelly Reichardt and again edited by Kelly Reichardt, and this time around John Raymond gets the sole writing credit. So as I've mentioned in the previous videos, he's been her writing partner for quite a while. On Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy, they got co-writing credits. This time it's just Raymond's credit. Reichardt turned to the cinematographer Chris Blauvelt, I think it's Blauvelt, who she's continued to work with since this film, and so it seems she's kind of finally found a visual composer whose understanding of her vision works for her in terms of how he translates it to the screen, which is interesting that started with Meek's Cutoff because it's a beautifully shot and composed film, but it's also shot in Academy ratio, which is an odd choice these days, although other films have been making that choice recently or over the last 10 years, let's say. Probably one of the best known being Andrea Arnold's Fish Tank, which actually came out a year before Meek's Cutoff. And of course, in Grand Budapest Hotel, Wes Anderson played around with the aspect ratio, including using Academy ratio for some of the scenes. But Blauvelt's cinematography in this film is magnificent for a couple reasons that I'll get into in a few minutes. The cast again includes Michelle Williams, who has become not a full-time cast member for Reichardt, but a frequent cast member in Reichardt's film since her first appearance in Wendy and Lucy. A sort of bravura performance by Bruce Greenwood as Meek, the namesake of the Cutoff on the Oregon Trail. Will Patton shows up again, who was the mechanic in Wendy and Lucy. Paul Dano and Zoe Kazan play a couple, a real-life couple by that point, and still today, I think. Shirley Henderson, Neil Huff, and Tommy Nelson. And the cast is rounded out by Rod Rondeau, who plays the character known as the Indian. And that's it. That's the entire cast. It's a small cast. It's about 9 or 10 people in total, and much like Reichardt's earlier films, this is the story of a journey. It's the story of hope against odds, and it's the story of not just a journey, but searching. This time quite literalized. So whereas in Old Joy, the journey and the accompanying search was a journey up into the woods for a weekend and a search for friendship, a reconnection with the past, with past friends. In Wendy and Lucy, the journey was Wendy's journey from Indiana to Alaska, and the search, I guess thematically or metaphorically, could be Wendy's search for her purpose or her meaning, but more literally is her search for Lucy, her dog, who she loses in this small town in Oregon as she gets waylaid on her journey. But here in Meek's Cutoff, the journey and the search are in many ways one and the same, although again, I think they could be metaphorized for something bigger. Meek's Cutoff is set in the 1840s. It's very loosely based on a true story of pioneers heading west, and they're heading to Oregon, and they're taking a divergent route from the Oregon Trail, which is known as Meek's Cutoff. It's a shortcut. Not for them. And it's named after Stephen Meek, who's a character in the film who leads them on this precarious journey. What are they looking for? What are they searching for? A new home. But quite literally, they're searching for their destination. They are trapped in a game of Oregon Trail. And for most of the film, it doesn't look good. What's the film about? There are three families, the Tetherows, the Whites, and the Gateleys. There's some implication, very subtle, and maybe I've even misread it a little bit, that when they began their journey, there may have been others. But for the length of the film, there are these three families, two couples, and then a third couple with a teenage son, and they're also pregnant with another child on the way. And they are heading west, like so many did in the United States. They're often talked about as being immigrants, which I find interesting and fascinating in the film, because Oregon at that point is unsettled territory, and I believe, if my history serves me correctly, is not United States territory still at that point. Contested, certainly, by the Native American tribes, the many Native American tribes that still live there, although we only see one of them. But also, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, historian, by the British, who kind of owned it still at that point. So they're heading west. They're going through this pass, this sort of flat hollow that plateaus in spots, very barren, limited water, and they're being led by Stephen Meek. Stephen Meek was a real historical figure. He explored this area extensively, and he would eventually settle in Oregon. He was known as a trapper and an explorer, and historically, at least as far as I could find out reading for this, which is mostly on Wikipedia, fairly successful, and ended up kind of retiring to Oregon, lived out his life there. I think at the end of his life moved down to California, which I believe is where he died. Here he's been hired, and we don't know the circumstances. So like a lot of Reichardt films, it starts in medias res. We are in the cutoff. We are in the part of Oregon that for the whites, for the Americans, is unexplored. And presumably at some point before this, Meek convinced the party to take this cutoff, to take this alternate route that he says he knew, because it'll get them there quicker. And as the film opens, they're already lost. I mean, we see this as Paul Dano's character carves on a piece of wood. And we hear it in conversations like this one between Emily and Solomon Tetherow as they talk about how far they're falling behind.
2 weeks, he said, and we'd be in the pass, and it's been over 5. We haven't even seen a mountain yet.
So as the film opens, we're already in a state of crisis. It's low-level crisis at this point, but it's beginning with us and these characters on this trail, already aware, already, with this growing sense that they are lost in the middle of a barren landscape that they know nothing about, and they're running out of water. Not only that, but the Tetherows, particularly Emily, played by Michelle Williams, don't trust Meek. And so I've talked about this in my previous 2 Reichardt videos. She's a master at establishing tension, almost thriller-like conditions through her depiction of almost minutia and the character's response to that minutia. Now, this is not minutia. They're lost in the wilderness, and that's scary. But when we open, they have water, they have food, they have their 3 wagons, they have their health, and they're only lost a little bit. They're lost, but they're lost a little bit. They're lost to such a little extent that Meek believes them not to be lost, or at least professes that's what he believes. And I'll come back to the character of Meek in a moment. But just by having Dano's character carved lost and having the Tetherows have this late night conversation expressing their doubt in their guide, the tension is there. And the first half of the film is going to maintain this because they are going to find water and then they're not. They're not going to find water for a long stretch. So there's a little bit of respite just in the opening minutes of the film, and then from there on there's nothing. And everything Meek tells them doesn't come true. Now, Meek is a fantastic character. He's the only character in the film for most of it who gives it life. The pioneers are dour, they're frightened, they're serious, they know what's at stake, and they're not going to expend their energy on sort of the exuberant hope of what they're going to do when they get to their new home in the West. Meek, however, even if he is lost, even if he's led them into the middle of nowhere with no hope of getting them out, he has the confidence of having been there before. He also has the sort of rapscallion nature of the tall tale teller, that sort of American frontiersman who makes everything bigger, who takes everything, even if it was big, and makes it bigger. You know, so he tells stories to the boy about killing wild animals and eating them, and he loves to have this expression where he says, like, hell's full of bears, but this ain't hell, so don't worry. And Bruce Greenwood plays him. It's just like a fantastic, he chews it up. And in a lot of films, you would find this kind of performance to be like, ah, too much. But in comparison to the more sober pioneers, it's actually the sort of only fun in the film, even as you know when you're watching it that he's probably full of it, at least to a certain extent. And that is basically the film. They wander through the wilderness. They are wandering through the wilderness at the beginning of the film, and they're wandering through the wilderness at the end of the film. It is a film with an open and ambiguous ending. It's a very cool ending. I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's a very sort of thought-provoking ending, but we don't accompany them to the end, whether it's the end through sort of having their guts picked out by vultures on the plains, or whether it's the end of them finally reaching their destination and Meek being somewhat redeemed. This is it. We spend an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes with these families in a heightened state of crisis as they wander through the wilderness, lost and keenly aware of their diminishing water supply. The big change in the film comes about, well, not quite halfway through, when they meet the Indian. He shows up a couple times. Michelle Williams' character spots him. It seems like maybe he's following them, or he's monitoring them, or maybe he's even kind of gently nudging them in a certain direction by him appearing in the distance here. This might push them slightly different direction so that they can avoid him or whomever he might represent, his tribe or his people. But eventually Emily Tetherow, Michelle Williams, sees him up close. She goes to the men and they give chase and they capture him. And this changes the film, and it changes the dynamic in the community, or the traveling, the troupe. Because Meek wants to kill him. Meek's just outright wants to kill him. Meek, at least through his expression, has had many encounters with different Native Americans, with different tribes. He has opinions about different and specific tribes. All of those opinions are bad. And to Meek, this can only lead to one end. Him tricking them, him trapping them, him leading them in one way or another to their deaths.
No, I know my word isn't worth much in these parts, but in this case, I'm just a show at sundown. We kill him now.
Tetherow, though, has another idea that he might be able to lead them, if not through the pass, through the cutoff, at least to water. I don't think it's out of any sort of altruistic sense for the Indian. I think it's because she's using him. But she sees a use for him that Meek doesn't, or that Meek won't acknowledge. So in one sense, you get caught up in this drama of Emily versus Meek, and the film has feminist undertones, and the film wants you to see Emily as sober and clear-headed, if a little bit rash, but to kind of be on her side, whereas Meek, as this larger-than-life kind of blowhard who might have got them lost, is meant to be a mild antagonist, let's say. So you're meant to kind of not be on his side. The trap in there is that they're all exploiting Indian land, and they're all immigrants, they're all foreigners on this land, they're all there representing, you know, the next 200 years of degradation of the land at the hands of kind of American imperialism and environmental destruction. So as you find yourself choosing sides, oh, that Michelle Williams, boy, she's a hard-headed woman and she's great, and I hope she's right, and that through her, you know, wisdom and brilliance, she convinces this Indian to lead them to water. Wait a second. Both of them are exploitative. It's just that she's smarter or more pragmatic in her understanding of how she can exploit the appearance of this Indian. The Indian talks quite a bit in the film, but one of the decisions the filmmakers made, and they've been quite sort of insistent about this, was not to translate his dialogue. So nothing he says is clear, and Reichardt has talked about how she wanted the viewer to be in the position of the pioneers, which kind of goes to what I was just saying in your choice of allegiance, but also in terms of not knowing what's going on. There's an article I will link to in the description below where some journalists tried to sort of track down some translators of Native American languages, and apparently the performer used a couple different languages here, his own language and this older, rarer language that would have been, likely would have been the language of choice for this Indian character at this time. And they also tracked down the actor, but he wouldn't totally comment on it. And Reichardt doesn't make her full scripts completely available, and it's very hard to find production scripts of her films. I know I've tried because I teach her films in screenwriting classes sometimes, and I can never give her scripts to my students. So Rod Rondeau has been reluctant to comment upon his dialogue in the film because a lot of what was shot was not used, so he doesn't know what parts that he performed are in the film, and he hasn't seen it, at least last I knew. So there's some guesswork as to what he's saying, and mild spoiler here, so if you want to skip ahead about a minute, go ahead. It seems like mostly he is amenable to helping them. He is aware that this is a troublesome situation. He also seems to talk about this being a dream. And if you think this is in the 1840s, and this is in the sort of upper Northwest, so at this point the intersection between the Native Americans and the whites would have been not non-existent, but minimal compared to sort of the East Coast and the Mississippi River areas and things like that. So he's talking about, is this a dream? Am I dreaming? Am I dead? And so on. So his willingness to help them is in part driven by his fascination with his state. But he does seem willing to help them. They give him a blanket. He might ask for the blanket. They don't know that, but they give it to him. And this is maybe a coincidence, which leads him to believe, I asked for the red blanket, they gave me the blanket, so now I'm going to help them. It's all kind of unclear, but he doesn't seem hostile. I only know this after the fact, because throughout the rest of the film, while the Indian is there, many of the pioneers believe him to be hostile. Zoe Kazan's character in particular goes into near hysterics because she's convinced that around every corner, over every bluff, behind every tree is the rest of his tribe coming to kill her and kill them. And she almost can't leave this state of panic. And Meek needles that, because what Meek wants to do is kill the Indian throughout the entirety of the film. And he never expresses why he wants to kill the Indian beyond his belief, or his professed belief, that the Indian's a savage and it has death in store for them. But my reading of it is also that he wants to be the savior. He wants to be Stephen Meek. He wants to be the one who gets them through the cutoff that will eventually bear his name, although he doesn't know that yet. Although there is a little meta moment in the film where he's talking to the boy about some hills in the distance, and he says, "Oh, we'll name it after you. It doesn't have a name yet."
Call them Jimmy's Mountains. What do you say to that?
I suppose so.
Mm-hmm. Jimmy's Mountains. Yeah, we get the Willamette Valley. I'll tell the cartographers. We'll print it on the map.
And eventually this stretch of land will be called Meek's Cutoff. But anyway, it seems to me that he wants to, you know, it's his ego, his male ego, his frontiersman's ego, his that kind of braggadocio that his whole character is about. And to have his position subsumed by this unnamed and unknown Indian is a blow to his ego and a blow to his pride. So for him, it seems to me, this is never like explained, but it seems to me he'd rather kill the Indian and have them remain lost forever till they die than he would have the Indian actually be the one to get them to water and maybe even get them through the cutoff to their destination. The film is very aware of gender roles at the time, and I mean very aware. So it depicts them in more than one way, and this is one of the things that I think's fascinating about it. It's almost like there are public gender roles, even though the public is just these three families and Meek, and private gender roles, which mainly we see between the Tetherows. In public, the men make all the decisions. So much so that when it's time to make a decision, repeatedly throughout the film, the men distance themselves from the women. They actually walk away, and we get several scenes where the women are left standing above them on a hill, or on the other side of the wagon train, or at a distance or at a remove, and talking amongst themselves like, "Can you hear what they're saying? What are they saying?" Early in the film, we're put in the place of the women as viewers, so we don't hear what the men are saying either.
It seems to purposely like my order. I can't say for sure, Solomon, but she thinks I'm the only one who...
What are they talking about? Were you told?
Your husband didn't say?
Not this time.
This is very reminiscent to me of that scene from Old Joy, if you've watched that video, where Mark takes a call from his wife and walks away from the car while Kurt sits in the car and watches, and we don't hear most of Mark's conversation with his wife. Kurt there is in a position very similar to the women. Eventually, as the film progresses, sometimes we are privy to the men's conversations, but it always returns us back to the women and their sort of curiosity, their quandary, and their sense of frustration. Because oftentimes, the men sort of convene these private little sessions based on knowledge that's brought to the group by the women. For instance, at one point, they come to this kind of cliff, gradual cliff face, steep but not, you know, sheer. And the Indian begins talking about them. It's kind of like a deep valley, and he starts talking about the other side. they think he's pointing, and everyone's confused as to what he's saying, and they're wondering, like, how are we going to get through this? And Michelle Williams, Emily, figures out, or thinks she's figured out, he's telling us from his hand signals and what he's saying, that there's water on the other side.
He's saying we're close. He's saying just over the hill, just over there.
It's a steep grade.
This constant sort of public diminishment of the women's potential contribution to the decision making is continually reinforced throughout the film. In private, however, there's a different story, and we get several of these lovely but difficult to watch scenes set at night, and it's very dark. Chris Blovelt worked with Harris Savides before he died. In fact, Blovelt took over the bling ring for Savides, I believe. And he has that similar understanding of, or practice of, shooting in natural light, even natural darkness. So there are these scenes that are only lit by a very dim lamp. They're hard to see. If you watch the film, watch it in a dark room, because any kind of sunlight or lamplight on your TV or computer screen or whatever will obscure these scenes. But what happens in them is the Tetherows meet in their own private conferences. And in these scenes, Emily actually does a lot of the talking, and Solomon listens to her. He takes her counsel. It's very interesting that the film is aware of this difference, or at least it depicts this difference in the public and the private gender roles, because in the public, the distinction is very important and necessary. And it's almost even without question. None of the men are like, you know, last night in the tent, Emily said something really clever, so maybe she should be in on this. There's no, that's like beyond the scope of their reason, you know? Whereas in private, and we mostly see it with the Tetherows, although we also get it with the Gately's on a couple of occasions, Paul Dano and Zoe Kazan's characters. And so here's an example of one time, and it is really dark, so that's just the way it looks in the film, of Solomon taking Emily's counsel.
Is he ignorant? Or is he just plain evil? That's my quandary. It's impossible to know.
We can't know.
That's very comforting, Mr. Tetherow.
Well, we made our decision. This is all gonna be a bad dream soon. It's gonna be a story to tell.
I don't blame him for not knowing. I blame him for saying he did.
So throughout the film, Solomon is inclined to listen to Meek. His sort of pragmatic approach to all this is, we hired Meek. Meek might be a buffoon, but even as a buffoon, he's the only one with a remote idea of what's going on here. So we can't cut him loose. But at the same time, because of his evening or nighttime conferences with Emily, he has a very healthy and hearty skepticism about Meek. So he's never on Meek's side per se, even as he's willing to let Meek continue to guide them within reason. And this actually contributes to a lot of the tension in the film, because Meek is just single-minded. He's like, come with me, go where I'm going, this is how we're gonna do it. And the men are inclined to do it, but with hesitation. And that hesitation, you know, you're out in the wilderness, this is a Western, and death is around every corner, and what you're waiting for in the film is the blow up, the confrontation, the sort of pistols at sundown. And so that kind of hesitation around Meek's leadership adds to the tension of them being lost, and the tension of them running out of water, and the tension that's fueled by the women's doubts and then fears, and then, at least for a couple of them, hysteria. And this is again like what Reichardt does. She takes these situations where this could be in another film, and I've talked about this in previous videos, in another film, this would be a sort of second half of Act 2. You know, this would be the sort of part where we spend 20 minutes with them back in Illinois or Ohio, wherever they're coming from, and then we spend a good 20 minutes with them on the journey, and Meek probably kills some game for them, so they're like, oh, Meek's great, and then they get to the cutoff, and then they get lost, and this becomes, you know, this 100-minute film becomes the sort of 20-minute compressed, like, all is lost moment, and then, oh, they find their way back, and the good Indian saves them. But Reichardt sees that and pulls it apart, and then looks at every moment, every gesture, and she spends time with them. There's this scene that I just absolutely love, and it's one of the longest set pieces in the film, which is when they're at the top of that cliff, that sort of bluff I was talking about, where Emily becomes convinced that the Indian is indicating there's water over there, and they decide to go, and to get their wagons down, they have to let them down with rope one at a time, and the film actually spends several minutes watching them lower each wagon one at a time. And it gives you this sense of the patience that these people must have had, the endurance they must have lived with, the determination that sort of drives them west. And it's one of my kind of favorite moments in the film. You know, I'm into slow movies, so of course this is going to excite me. Other people might be like, okay, that was cool watching the first wagon go down. Why is she showing us the second one? Why is she showing us the third one? Of course, again, with each wagon descent, there's more tension and more tension. Are they going to make it with all the wagons? Watch the movie and find out. All of this leads up to a final confrontation, which does not resolve the film, but which resolves a lot of these thematic issues I've brought up. And that's when they just get to the sort of the end of their rope. There's still no water, and Meek becomes convinced that the Indian is either leading them in circles or leading them to death, and decides to take the Indian's life.
That's it. You've taken us just about as far as you need to go. End this game right now.
Put it away, Meek. There's no need.
Oh, I see a need. Well, yeah, so you got some feeling in it after all.
I'd be wary.
You people got no idea what you are dealing with here.
Well, neither do you, Mr. Meek. You proved that amply by now.
Seems like your woman got some Indian blood in her, Mr. Tethero.
She got something, all right.
In a lot of ways, this is the climax of the film, because we've seen Emily throughout exerting her opinion, mostly in those darkly lit scenes in the tents at night, but also with snide comments she makes to Meek. And at one point, Meek even says to her, I reckon you don't like me very much. And she's like, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. I just want to get through this. But he knows, he feels the sting of her words. But none of them sting so hard as in that scene where she tells him, you've got no idea what you're dealing with either, Mr. Meek. And you've proven that. You know, she's just undercutting everything about him. And here's her courageous moment. She does it. She doesn't know if the men are going to back her, because this is public, right? This is the realm in which the men go here and the women go here. And she is counting on her husband mainly, but also the other men to support her. And it's a key moment in the film that brings together in many ways all of the threads that have slowly been developing. And it feels in a lot of ways like a resolution, but as I said, it's not a resolution of their plight because the film never gives us that. Meek's Cutoff has been described as an anti-Western, a feminist Western. I guess it is those things, but I think, and it's a great Western, the costumes are fantastic, the setting is amazing, the cinematography is just incredible, and the way he uses the Academy ratio in classical ways, but also in non-classical ways, he kind of breaks the rule of thirds all over the place, but intentionally. So it's really a joy to watch the film. You get a sense of the vastness of this landscape that they're in. It's all those things. It's a Western, it's an anti-Western, it's a feminist Western, but it's also another of Reichardt's examinations of how the minutiae of decision-making, about how the little things in life, little changes in demeanor, how small desires become big, how all of these things can change a life, can turn a life, can push a journey into a direction that was not planned, and what the characters must then do to accommodate the new direction, to come to terms with it, and hopefully to adjust to it and continue on. In Old Joy, Mark ends up deciding just to go back to his life. In Wendy and Lucy, despite having been stripped of almost everything, Wendy decides to hop on that train and persevere. In Meek's Cutoff, we're left not knowing. And it's the kind of thing where if you're not into ambiguous endings, if you're not into open endings, you might find it incredibly frustrating. But the way it's done, the way it's shot, the way it's filmed, the point of view shots, what the Indian does, what they find, all of those things add up to me to a very sort of contemplative moment that really makes this film almost poetic in its unwillingness to answer the questions, what if? Thanks for watching, everybody. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter. I hope you have enjoyed these 3 videos on the films of Kelly Reichardt. I'll return to her again in the future, as I've said throughout all of them. She's one of my favorite filmmakers working in America today, and I think she's making some of the most kind of intriguing, fascinating, non-Hollywood films, but non-Hollywood films that are still kind of narrative and character films, but just a completely different, I think she's working on a sort of Cassavetes level, although her tone and her approach is different. That kind of, like, what she's willing to divulge and what she's not willing to divulge in her films ascends to that level for me. So I'll be back with more of her films in the future, but for now, I'm going to wrap up this series. I hope you liked it, and as I've mentioned on, I think, my live stream, coming up soon, I'm going to be talking about French films for several weeks because it's spring, and I decided why not have a French spring. Until then, thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, as usual, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't. Please share this video with a friend. Hop on over to my Patreon if that makes you feel good. But whatever you do, keep watching movies.